All right, it's time to take another look at Endeavour Flight 4819. That's the flight up in Toronto, Canada, that impacted the ground so hard that the right wing came off the airplane. The airplane rolled over. You recall this one? And everybody had to scoot out the overwing exit. There were no fatalities on this, several injuries, but minor in nature. Let's take another look at that on the video, and then I'll pick up because I've got in my hot little hand the report on that flight. Let's see.
2, 3, oh! Oh! Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, that's... Tower, you're seeing this airplane just crash into 2-3.
All right, it's out now, folks, finally. The Air Transport Safety Investigation, that's the equivalent of the NTSB, but up in Canada. They've done an extremely thorough job here. It's about 18 to 20 pages of details about that flight. And we've seen that airplane roll over and over again on TV. I'm going to talk about my initial analysis and make some adjustments on that from my first conclusions based on what I'm reading in front of me, and then add some things that I think are kind of shocking. And in addition to that, there is something that's been said about the crew that is just completely wrong, and I'll clarify that again by the end. The conditions that day up on the 17th of February, it was gusty winds. You can see that from the video. The winds were 270 at 28, gusting to 35. That's a strong, strong wind. They were landing on runway 23, so 270 and runway 23, that's 40 degrees off the runway heading, and it gusts up to 35. You can see that airplane's coming in and it's doing a fair amount of bouncing around before it touches down on the runway. Now, they were in blowing snow, and here to me is the first kind of mitigating situation that we didn't know initially from watching the video. The runway up there, runway 23, is a 200-foot runway. It was plowed, the snow was plowed to 160 feet wide. So normally 200 feet wide, plowed to 160 feet wide. Why is that significant? It's significant from a pilot's visual perspective, because as the pilots are coming in, their peripheral vision is watching a runway of a certain width come up, and they're going to slow down and go into their flare based on how high they think they are above the runway. If the runway is narrower, you're going to think you're higher than you are, and you're going to delay your flare. And you can see they didn't even flare at all on this. So there's a visual perception that you're higher than you are. You think you still got some more altitude to lose? Nope, they didn't, because the runway was narrower because of the snow plowing. Now, here's the setup. The flight proceeded uneventful, all right, and for a while at least, and the crew received clearance from the instrument landing system approach to runway 23. So they were cleared to land, and basically coming through, I don't know, about 1,000 feet. They were stable. They were on final approach. And typically on an approach, we will, based on the weight of the airplane, come up with what's called a VREF speed. It's a reference speed that the airplane is aiming for to fly the approach at before they touch down. Every airplane in the world adds 5 knots to that. It's always VREF plus 5. That plus 5 is called the bug speed. Now, on some airplanes, there usually actually was a little plastic nib that you would actually slide around an old round, what we call a steam dial now in these days, so that as the airspeed indicator was coming, you'd aim for that little plastic bug that you'd put right there, and you'd keep it right there at that speed. There's not many airplanes like that around. Some of the older ones are still like that, but the newer ones now, it's all computerized. We still call it a bug speed. Here at Endeavour Airlines, their procedure is to add 5 to the reference speed, and then if it's gusty conditions, they will go as many as 10 knots above their ref speed. So in this case, according to the report, the ref speed is 139 knots. They're going to put the bug in the computer at 144. But for some unexplained reason, they just add 5 to that. Now, that would be their gust additive. Most of us would just move the bug up that 10 knots or put that in the computer so that the auto throttles have something to reference. The auto throttles would be trying to gain 149 knots or keep it at 149 knots. On this particular airplane, there are no auto throttles. So it's something that they have to do manually. So it's one more thing they have to remember is add plus 5 to that bug reference speed. The point is this: they're aiming for 149 knots on this approach. They could add more to it. Most airlines will add maybe 15 or even 20 knots at a max to a reference speed, especially in gusty wind conditions like this. The rule of thumb is that you take half of the gust component. In this case, the gust is 35 knots. That would be 17 and a half, but no more than 10. So you kind of cap it out at 10 knots. In my airplane, I might add up to 17 knots. Why do I want to do that? I want to keep some energy over those wings so that if something at the end of the approach doesn't look right, I've got plenty of juice, plenty of energy in those wings. And when I push up the power, we're going to pop right back up into the air. We're going to see here in a minute, they lose all of their energy and they get into what's called a sinker. And a sinker is not good. So they're aiming for 149. Let's call it 150 to round it up. Then the aircraft descended through 500 feet. Everything is stable at 500 feet. The aircraft indicated an airspeed of 150 knots. They were basically just 1 knot above what they were aiming for. Its ground speed is 121 knots. It's important to understand the difference between the two because that's the headwind component. So basically there's a 30-knot headwind component at this point. The engine thrust indicated 64% N1. What does that mean? It means that the power was back up on the engine. And so it was in a good spot. A stabilized approach is on speed, on altitude, on glide slope, and your power is back up, not at idle. So they're stabilized here at 500 feet. And the co-pilot is flying the airplane. We'll talk about the crew, their qualifications and their flight time and all of that here before the end of the video. So now they're stable. So they're set up, now they're stable. But now they start losing airspeed, and it happens here at 175 feet above the ground. At 175 feet AGL, above ground level, its indicated airspeed for the airplane was now 144 knots. So they've lost 6 knots of that airspeed that they had at 500 feet. The ground speed is still 121 knots, and the rate of descent is 672 feet per minute. That's a completely normal rate of descent. You want something right in that ballpark. So far, they're still okay, and the N1 is still at 64%, so the power on the engine is still up. Now, here's what happens next. Here's where the bad move comes in, and it could be due to inexperience. It could be due to a lot of things, but there should have been some intervention at this point, and there wasn't. All right. At 153 feet, that's only 20 feet later. 20 feet later, they experience basically an increase in indicated airspeed. It goes from 144 to 154. Why was that? Most likely, I don't believe the airplane accelerated. That's a headwind. That's a gust of headwind that gives you kind of a false indication that you've gained a bunch of airspeed. There is a temptation on the part of a less experienced pilot to look down at the airspeed, see it increase like that, and say, "Oh, I'm going to pull the power back to slow down." And that's exactly what the co-pilot or the pilot at the controls did. She pulled the power back all the way to idle, it looks like, at 154 knots of ground speed. It was consistent with performance of an increasing headwind, it says here in the report, which I would agree with. The pilot flying pulled back the thrust levers, and as a result, over the following 5 seconds now, the N1 decreased from 64% down to 43%. That's basically idle. So she idled out the engines, all right, getting no extra power from them, and it remained at 43% N1 until touchdown, or I'm going to call it impact because it wasn't really a touchdown. The airspeed then at that point began to decrease consistently, and then it creates what's called a sinker. You've got that false indication that you've picked up airspeed. You think you're going too fast. You pull back at 160 feet above the ground. You pull back all your power. You've got to add power back in before you touch down. If you don't, all of a sudden the bottom is going to drop out and you're going to get into what's called a sinker. Now, at the next indication is at 50 feet now, according to the report. The indicated airspeed was 145 knots. She hasn't really lost that much airspeed just yet. The ground speed is 112 knots, so it's decreased quite a bit. All right. The rate of descent now is 1,114 feet per minute. She went from 670, which is a normal glide slope, to twice that much. All right. Now, you can feel this. If you're in the cockpit, you're looking out and you can feel the bottom dropping out. At this point, either she should have come on with power or the captain should have come on with power, but somebody should have spooled those engines back up, but they left them down there at idle. and it has a disastrous consequence. The Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, which is an electronic system in the airplane, at 50 feet started the countdown. 50, 40, 30, 20, all right? At 2.6 seconds before touchdown, according to the report, that same system barks out, sink rate, and it sounds exactly like that. It's telling you that your sink rate is way too much for where you are. In other words, you got to come up with power, you got to pull the nose up, or you got to do both. They don't do any of that. It indicates a high sink rate. The aircraft indicated 136 knots of indicated airspeed at this point. Remember, they were aiming for 149. They're a full 13 knots below where they should be. They've got all the power pulled back and they're plummeting towards the ground. As you can see in the video, there was no attempt at a flare. They just basically kind of drove the airplane right straight down into the ground at this high sink rate. 1.6 seconds before touchdown, it says the aircraft indicated an airspeed of 136 knots, a ground speed of 111 knots. And here's where the angle of bank comes in. This was my original analysis, was that the wingtip actually caught the ground before they touched down or as they touched down. I'm going to modify that just a little bit. They were at 4.7 degrees angle of bank when they were at 150 feet. Now they're at 5.9 degrees angle of bank. When they touch down, when the actual right main mount impacts the ground, they are at 7.5 degrees of right wing down angle of bank angle. And so that would be, tells me that that right wingtip probably struck the ground at the same time that that right strut struck the ground. That right strut hits the ground so hard that it collapses the down lock. It's, what's the name of it here? I think it's some sort of a brace. They refer to it here in the report, but it's a brace that holds the main mount down. It impacts the ground so hard it breaks and the landing gear collapses back up into the wing, causing so much force, and it's a 3G impact on the ground. So this airplane weighs somewhere around 75,000 pounds. Multiply that by 3, and that's the impact force on the ground. You get basically a 210, 220,000 pound impact on the ground, much more than the airplane was rated for. That strut now goes up through the wing. I believe that that right wingtip impacted the ground at the same time, causing that twisting moment. It weakens the wing. The wing breaks open. You see, I think I originally said that that was snow coming up. I now will change that and say that was fuel coming out of the back of the wing. It now ignites. You see the big fireball as the airplane impacts. The right wing breaks off. Fortunately for them, the right wing broke all the way off, and it descends or kind of stays behind the airplane as the lift from that left wing, or the rolling moment caused by the wing breaking off, causes that left wing to gently kind of come up, and the airplane ends up on its back. When it ends up on its back, the fireball is behind it. Everybody now begins to initiate the evacuation from the airplane. Most everybody went out the overwing exit, the one that was dripping with all the fuel. The pilots were stuck up in the cockpit. How did they get out? Well, they could have come out through the door that they go into, but the flight attendant seat was jammed in, and because of the torquing of the airplane, they couldn't get that door open. There is an overhead hatch for them to escape from on that airplane, but guess what? They're upside down. So they're trapped for a little bit. They managed to get enough of that overhead hatch opened up, and some passengers come around and help pull the pilots out. That's how the pilots got out of the airplane. And the rest we know about. Some people went to the hospital, but everybody at least walked away in one piece from that crash. Let's talk now about the experience level of the crew, because a lot of stuff has been said out there on the internet, and folks, the internet's full of a lot of stuff. I've heard that one or both of the pilots had failed check rides in the past. There's no indication of that. In fact, I think the airline came out quickly after that and said that is not true. They didn't fail any check rides, although your biggest check ride is the one that you just had. But that's another issue for another day. The captain had, and this is what's shocking to me, here's what I found just kind of incomprehensible about this whole thing. The captain had been hired in 2007. That's 18 years ago. And the captain has a total of 3,570 total flight hours, 3,570 total flight hours. So if the captain needed 1,500 hours to get hired by Endeavor, that captain has only accumulated another 2,000 hours over the last 18 years. When you do the math on that, that's less than 10 hours per month that captain has been at this airline. This is according to the report, a simulator instructor. I think this guy has spent a lot of time in the simulator, probably maybe too much time in the simulator. One of the things that's missing these days with many of the pilots that we're hiring is just the good old-fashioned stick and rudder. How do you fly an airplane without an autopilot, without all the automation? Just get out there and get your flight time and get used to how an airplane responds in flight. We're hiring a lot of new people now, and we're teaching them how to turn dials and to push buttons and to flip switches. But that's depending on the automation, and you can get a certain level of competency with that. But in a situation like this where you got to know how an airplane flies, a lot of that is missing. That's my conjecture on this. The co-pilot now is what's called a restricted ATP. So the co-pilot doesn't even have 1,500 hours yet. Now, the minimum to get hired is 1,500 hours unless you have an aeronautics degree. If you have a 4-year aeronautics degree, you can get hired with 1,000 hours of flight time. I think that was most likely her situation. She has 400 plus hours on this airplane. The captain only has 760 on this type of airplane. So the co-pilot, having been hired only in October, I think January of 2024, having only been around for about 13 months, has a lot more really kind of consolidated time on that aircraft than the captain did over that 18-year time span. And so the more experienced of the two pilots in this case, I'm going to say it's the co-pilot. All right. But even so, the co-pilot got caught in that sinker scenario where they got the kind of the fake headwind airspeed rise. She pulls the power back, doesn't ever reintroduce power, leaves it at that, and then visually thinks she's still higher above the runway than she is. Even when you got that final warning of sink rate from the computer, somebody should have slammed the power levers up. The captain should have taken the airplane from the first officer, seeing that situation develop. I just don't think either one of them saw it developing the way they should have, and they certainly didn't respond appropriately or quickly enough in that incident. So the big shocker and the big takeaway for me on this is this one. The captain's low time and the captain's non-assertiveness as a situation is developing. Yeah, were they landing under challenging circumstances? Yeah, they should have been briefing that, and they should have been aware of that, and they should have been on edge to go around if they needed to. They definitely needed to go around in this situation, and they didn't. It doesn't look like there was any indication of any response to any of the warnings that they got, either the visual ones, the oral ones, or just the common sense ones from experienced flying. So we're going to take a look here in the future. We're going to do another video on a comparison between the LaGuardia landing, where they tipped a wing and they scraped the runway, but the captain took the airplane and went around, and this incident up in Toronto. There are some startling similarities, but the outcomes were completely different, and I'm going to do an analysis on that not too long from now. But folks, this is the initial report from the Air Transportation Safety Investigation up in Canada. I thought you'd want to know my insights on it. Again, everybody walked away, but wow, this is an unfortunate situation that just simply should not have taken place. My analysis is the crew should have responded more quickly than they did, and they didn't. When the final report comes out, we'll follow up and we'll tell you what we think about it when the Canadians get around to doing the final report. Now you know. I'm Captain Steeve. Fly safe.